Yesterday, I was the pulse of his world. Today, I am a ghost in my own hallway, while he acts like our entire history was a fever dream. If you've been discarded overnight, you aren't just being ignored, you are being strategically erased. Stay with me, because the silence you're hearing right now is actually a psychological weapon designed to break your sanity before the real assault begins. I felt that familiar cold dread, the kind that settles in your bones when you realize that the person you trusted most has simply deleted you from their reality. And as I sat there in the dark room with the light from the street lamp filtering through the blinds, I began to realize that the person I had been sleeping next to for years was a stranger who had been wearing a mask that finally fell away, leaving nothing but a void. I knew my sanity was on the line, and I realized I had to stop looking at the screen and start looking at the patterns, because the silence was not a mistake, and it was not a cooling off period, but it was a calculated move designed to make me feel small and insignificant and invisible. I started to replay every single conversation we had over the last 6 months, and I saw the gaps where I used to see bridges, and I saw the lies where I used to see promises, and I realized that he had been planning this exit while he was still telling me that he loved me more than life itself. This was not a normal breakup where two people drift apart or even explode in anger, but it was a surgical removal of my existence from his world. He had scrubbed his social media of my face, and he had changed his number without a second thought, and he had left me holding the bag of a shared life that he had simply walked away from. The silence was loud, and it was heavy, and it was meant to be a psychological weapon to force me into a state of panic and desperation. I watched the cursor blink on my computer screen, and I realized every digital trace of us was being systematically, for weakest sake, wiped away. He was erasing our history in real time while I was still trying to figure out what I had done wrong. The air in the apartment felt thin, and every piece of furniture we chose together now looked like a monument to a person who never truly existed. I noticed the way the closet looked so skeletal with his clothes gone, as if he had never even hung a coat there. The lack of explanation was the cruelest part, because it forced my brain to loop in an infinite cycle of self-blame and confusion, which was exactly what he intended. He wanted me paralyzed by the why, so I would be too weak to focus on the what, which was his calculated betrayal. The weight of the betrayal felt like a physical pressure on my chest, but I refused to let it crush me, because I knew that if I stayed in the victim role, I would never get out of this intact emotionally, and I had to become the detective of my own life. I remembered how he would talk about our future house in the country with the wrap around porch and the garden where we would grow our own vegetables, and he spoke about it with such detail that I could almost smell the fresh dirt and see the sunlight on the floorboards. But when I looked at the bank account, it was empty, and when I asked about the timeline, he would get angry and tell me I was ruining the mood with my constant demands. He was selling me a dream to keep me from noticing the nightmare of the present, and he was future faking every single day to ensure that I would keep providing him with the stability and the money and the emotional support he needed to keep his own ego inflated. I see now that he was essentially running a psychological Ponzi scheme where he promised me a payout of happiness that he never intended to deliver, while he used my resources to fund his own grandiose delusions of importance. He would talk about the names of our future children while he was actively looking for my replacement, and he would describe the color of the paint in a house we would never buy, just to distract me from the fact that he hadn't paid his share of the rent in 3 months. Every promise was a debt he never intended to pay, and every dream was a hook designed to keep me dragging his weight behind me. He used my deepest desires as a blueprint for his deception, and he built a castle in the air, knowing I was the only one paying for the bricks. I realized that the more I invested in his vision, the more I was actually funding my own emotional ruin, because the dream was the bait and the reality was the trap. He would spend hours browsing real estate websites, showing me mansions we could never afford, and the more I expressed doubt, the more he would accuse me of not believing in him or our love. He used my hope as a tether to keep me anchored to a sinking ship while he was already scouting for a new vessel. This was not just optimism or big thinking. It was a calculated manipulation of my attachment system to ensure I would never look too closely at the high-risk lack of progress in our actual lives. I looked at the messages from my sister and my best friend, and I saw the way they were changing their tone, because he had already been talking to them behind my back, and he had been planting seeds of doubt about my mental health for weeks before he left. He told them I was stressed and that I was acting erratic and that he was worried about me, but he was actually just setting the stage for the discard so that when it happened, everyone would think I was the one who drove him away. He recruited his flying monkeys, and he turned my own support system into a surveillance network for him, and I felt the walls closing in as I realized that I couldn't even trust the people I'd known my whole life because they had been manipulated by his charm and his fake tears. He used triangulation to make me feel isolated, and he used control to make sure that I had nowhere to turn when he finally pulled the rug out from under me. These individuals were just clay in his hands, molded into weapons against my peace of mind, while they believed they were performing an act of mercy. They would call me with that soft and condescending tone of voice, asking if I was okay and if I needed professional help, because he had told them I was losing my grip on reality. It was a group assault on my sanity, and it was a coordinated effort to make sure that even if I escaped him, I would have nowhere left to go and no one left to trust. I watched as people I once loved became soldiers in his army, and they began to parrot his lies with such conviction that I started to question if the floor beneath my feet was solid. He had created a collective delusion where he was the martyr and I was the unstable storm he had been trying to survive, and the betrayal of the group felt even deeper than the betrayal of the man. I realized that some of these friends were enjoying the drama, and they were getting a sense of self-importance from rescuing him from me. He had studied their insecurities too, and he gave them a role to play in his theater of hardship. This was social engineering at its most potent, because it stripped me of my community at the exact moment I needed it most, and it left me standing alone in a crowd of people who used to be my family. I remembered a specific night when I confronted him about a lie I found, and he didn't even blink or try to explain it. But instead, he just started crying and telling me how hard his childhood was and how I was just like everyone else who ever harmed him. He shifted from the aggressor to the victim in a matter of seconds, and I found myself holding him and apologizing for his behavior because his performance was so convincing that I actually believed I was the one being cruel. This was the victim-bully cycle, and he used it every time I got too close to the truth because he knew my empathy was my greatest weakness, and he knew exactly how to weaponize it against me. He would deny his actions and then attack my character and finally reverse the victim and offender roles until I was the one begging for forgiveness for a crime I didn't commit. This was the Darvo tactic in full effect, a calculated maneuver to evade accountability by triggering my rescue instinct at the exact moment he should have been answering for his actions. He would go from screaming at me in a terrifying rage to sobbing like a child who had been mistreated just to keep me off balance and to make sure I never felt safe enough to ask the real questions. I saw how he used his own tears as a shield and my conscience as a tool of manipulation. And I realized that every time I tried to hold him to a standard of truth, he would simply collapse into a pile of feigned misery until I gave up out of sheer exhaustion and guilt. It was like trying to hold a conversation with a phantom that changed its shape the moment you reached out to touch it. He would use phrases like, "I thought you were the one person who understood me," to make me feel like I was failing a test of loyalty whenever I pointed out his unhealthy behavior. The shift was so instantaneous that it felt like psychological whiplash, and it left me wondering if I was the one who was actually the wrongdoer in the relationship. I spent hours walking through the park trying to make sense of the psychological Ponzi scheme he had built, and I realized that every single grand promise was just a way to buy more time, and every single someday was a lie designed to keep me from seeing the today, which was full of neglect and emotional deprivation. He was a master of mirroring my desires, and he knew exactly what I wanted to hear. So he said it over and over again until I was addicted to the version of him that didn't exist. I had to face the fact that I had fallen in love with a reflection of myself and not a real human being. Because a real human being doesn't just discard another person like a piece of trash overnight without a single word of explanation. I had to reconcile the man who spoke about our future children with the man who now treated me like a ghost in the hallway of my own home. I realized that the grandiosity gap was his primary tool, and he used the height of his promises to hide the depth of his extreme indifference toward my actual well-being. He was never building a life with me, and he was only building a stage for himself to perform on while I provided the lighting and the audience. I walked past a florist and remembered him promising a house full of flowers every week, yet I couldn't remember the last time he had even bought a gallon of milk without complaining about the cost. The contrast between his words and his movements was a vast canyon, and I had been falling into it for years, believing I was flying. I remembered how he would take credit for my successes, as if his support was the only reason I achieved anything, while he simultaneously belittled my hard work in private. He was a parasite dressed as a partner, and he had been feeding on my vitality while telling me I was the one who was lucky to have him. The realization was bitter, but it was also the first breath of fresh air I had taken in years. I started to notice the groupthink assault at my workplace because we worked in the same building, and I could see the way his colleagues looked at me with a mix of pity and suspicion, and I knew he had been there too, telling his story of the long-suffering partner who just couldn't take it anymore. He was using gaslighting by tribe to ensure that his reputation remained pristine, while mine was dragged through the mud, and I realized that I couldn't fight them all because they were all under his spell, and they were all drinking the tainted nectar. I had to make the hardest decision of my life, which was to stop defending myself and stop trying to explain the truth to people who weren't interested in hearing it, because they had already decided who the villain was. I realized that any attempt to clear my name only made me look more like the unstable person he claimed I was, so I chose the path of strategic silence. I watched as people I had known for years turn their backs on me because his story was more comfortable than the truth, and because they couldn't believe that someone so charming could be so harmful in their pursuit of control. The whispers in the break room were like static in my ears, and I realized that the social discrediting he was performing was his way of ensuring I would be too ashamed to ever speak the truth about what happened behind closed doors. He had managed to weaponize my own professional environment against me, making every hallway feel like a gauntlet of judgment. I saw how he would walk through those same halls, smiling and greeting everyone as if nothing was wrong, while I was struggling to keep my hands from shaking. This was his power move, to show me that even if I left him, he would still own the world I lived in. I began to apply the 3-part rule in every interaction I had with the few people I still trusted, and I learned never to share my good news with anyone who might report it back to him, because I knew he would find a way to tarnish it. I learned to keep my hurt to myself, because showing it only gave him more power, and it only proved to his flying monkeys that I was as unstable as he said I was. I became a master of being indifferent, and I talked about the weather and the news and nothing that mattered to me, because I had to protect my inner world from the people who wanted to break it. I realized that my silence was my greatest weapon, and my lack of reaction was the only thing that would eventually break his hold over me, because he fed on my reactions, whether they were tears of joy or tears of distress. I stopped explaining, and I stopped defending, and I stopped reacting, because I realized that every bit of data I gave him was just more ammunition for him to use in his next attack. I practiced my neutral face in the mirror until it became a mask of my own, and I learned that being boring was the only way to become invisible to a predator who only hunts for high-intensity emotion. I realized that by providing indifferent news, I was giving them nothing to work with. No hooks for shame and no handles for manipulation. I became the gray rock in the middle of his storm, and while he tried to provoke me into a rage, I simply remained a quiet observer of his increasingly desperate attempts to get a rise out of me. This was the first time I felt a sense of control, because I was finally the one deciding what information left my mouth. The process of rebuilding was slow, and it felt like I was learning how to walk again after a major incident. But every day that I didn't check his social media, and every day that I didn't respond to a concerned text from one of his proxies, was a victory. I started to reclaim my dreams, and I realized that I didn't need him to go to Tuscany or to start a business or to have a happy life, because those were my dreams that he had just borrowed to keep me interested. I took my power back by realizing that he was just an empty shell who needed my light to feel alive. And once I stopped shining it on him, he would have to find someone else to exploit. I noticed how the grandiosity gap became wider in my memory, where the promised mansion stood in stark contrast to his inability to even handle the basic logistics of a shared life. I began to see the small fakes that preceded the big ones, like the way he would promise to call at 5 o'clock and never do it, or the way he would promise to fix a leak and let it drip for months while he talked about his plans for a palace. I reclaimed my weekends, and I reclaimed my peace, and I realized that the house I was building now was small, but the foundation was made of truth, and that made it stronger than any castle he had ever described. I spent my time reading books he had mocked and talking to people he had tried to isolate me from. Every small act of independence was a brick in the wall I was building between my future and his unhealthy influence. I realized that I was not just recovering from a relationship, but I was recovering from a long-term psychological attack. And the first step toward health was admitting how much harm had actually been done. I want you to listen to me very carefully, because if you are in this position right now, you need to know that you are not crazy and you are not the problem. You are targeted because you have a big heart, and because you are a builder, and because you have something that they want but cannot create for themselves. You must stop trying to solve the puzzle of why they left and start solving the puzzle of how to get yourself back. The solution is simple, but it is not easy, because it requires you to be colder than they are for a little while. You must go completely dark, and you must block the messengers and the spies and the people who say they just want to help both sides. There are no two sides to mistreatment, and there is no middle ground when someone is trying to shatter your soul. You have to understand that the people who carry his messages are just as dangerous as he is, because they are the ones who allow the unhealthy behavior to continue under the guise of concern. You must cut the ties to the entire network to save yourself. This is not about being mean or being petty, but it is about basic survival, and you cannot heal in the same environment that made you unwell. You must be ruthless in your self-protection, and you must realize that anyone who tells you to forgive and forget while you are still wounded is not your friend. They are simply people who want the conflict to go away so they can feel comfortable again, even if it means you have to stay in harm's way. Hold your line and do not let their tears or their sudden emergencies pull you back into the cycle, because the moment you step back in the mask will slip again, and you'll be right back where you started. Trust your gut and trust the facts of what they did rather than the words of what they said they would do. If they promised you the world but couldn't even give you respect, they were lying, and they will always be lying. You are the architect of your future, and you don't need a partner who is a psychological exploiter to build a beautiful life. Observe the shift for what it is, which is a tactical maneuver to regain control over your emotions, and do not soothe the person who just set your world on fire. You are worth more than an empty promise, and you are worth more than a someday that never arrives. The silence they gave you is a gift because it is the only time you will ever have to hear your own voice again, and you need to listen to what it is telling you about your own strength and your own value. Remember that the someday they promised was just a carrot on a stick, and as long as you are chasing it, they have power over you. Drop the stick and walk in a different direction. You will be amazed at how quickly their grand visions evaporate when they no longer have your energy to fuel them. Your life belongs to you, and it is time you started living it for yourself instead of for a ghost who never intended to stay. You are stronger than you realize, and you have already survived the hardest part, which was waking up to the truth. Stay sharp and stay focused on your own healing, and never let anyone tell you that your reality isn't real. I am here with you, and we are going to get through this together, one day at a time. Keep moving forward and don't look back, because there is nothing for you in the past but shadows. Take care of yourself and stay safe out there. Your sanity is your most valuable possession, and your peace is worth whatever cost you have to pay to protect it. You are the hero of this story, and the end of the narrative is entirely in your hands now. Remember that you are not a victim, but a survivor who has just been given a masterclass in human nature, and you will use this knowledge to ensure that you are never invisible again. Thank you for spending this time with me and for allowing me to share this journey with you, because I know how lonely it feels when the world seems to turn against you all at once. If this story resonated with you, and if you found a piece of your own truth in these words, I invite you to join our community by subscribing and liking this video so we can keep sharing these strategies for survival. You have the power to write a new chapter, and this time you are the one holding the pen. Don't let their intense silence define you, because your worth was never tied to their recognition in the first place. You are coming back to life, and that is the greatest revenge of all.